We need to talk about Gen Z. And no, this isn't another generic old guy rant about how nobody wants to work anymore, nor is it a coddling session about how they're just delicate little snowflakes. We've already systematically dissected the boomers, Gen X, and the millennials on this show, and today the diagnostic lens turns to the cohort who's currently aged anywhere from 14 to 29. As we typically do, let's establish the baseline right out of the gate. I don't know how else I can say this for you people to understand it, but this is a macroeconomic and psychological generalization. If you're 22 years old listening to this right now while working 2 jobs, managing your responsibilities, and staying grounded, I'm not talking about you specifically, but I am talking about the cultural matrix that you were forced to swim in every single day. Gen Z is the first generation in human history to have their developmental milestones fully outsourced to an automated algorithm. We built a digital panopticon, handed them the keys when they were 10 years old, and then had the audacity to wonder why they have a collective panic attack when an unknown number calls their phone. They aren't broken by nature, they're hyper-engineered by design. They're carrying the psychological weight of being their own gods in a world that has completely abandoned the concept of grace. Welcome back to Sober Psychology. I'm Michael. I'm a psychologist in training. I'm a sober dad, and I'm someone who spends almost every single day looking at the intersection of human brokenness, clinical data, and the immutable spiritual truth. In recovery, you learn very quickly that you can't heal what you refuse to look at honestly. And right now, our culture is lying to Gen Z. And Gen Z is lying to themselves. We're going to look at the psychological infrastructure of this generation, how they became hyper-individualistic, why they've weaponized clinical therapy language to isolate themselves, and what happens when you swap out a sovereign god for a curated internet timeline. Now, it's going to get uncomfortable. We're going to use some dark humor in order to cope with the absurdity of all of this, but we're going to find the truth. So let's dive in. To understand why a generation functions the way it does, you have to look at the macro environmental stressors that hit them during the critical periods of neurological and social development. Gen Z didn't choose their environment. They were dropped into a hyper-accelerated crucible. Let's look at the timeline of events that structurally shifted their reality. From 2007 to 2012, you've got the smart device explosion. The iPhone launches and social media platforms pivot from desktop novelties to mobile necessities. During this time, peer validation shifts from physical playgrounds to 24/7 digital metrics. And then from 2015 to 2019, you look at the institutional trust begin to collapse. Political polarization hyper-accelerates. Gen Z watches the adults in charge abandon nuance, which begins to leave young people with that distinct impression that the systems meant to protect them are fundamentally corrupt. And then from 2020 to 2022, you've got the great social interruption. The pandemic hits during prime formative years. Key developmental milestones like graduations, first jobs, early dating experiences are completely replaced by isolation and mandatory screen reliance. And moving on to 2023 to now, you've got the economic disillusionment. As Gen Z are entering adulthood, they are facing unprecedented inflation, an inaccessible housing market, and the rapid rise of automation and AI reshaping the job landscape before they even launch. So psychologically, what does this environment create? It creates an extreme shift from an internal locus of control to an external locus of control. When the macro world feels chaotic and unpredictable and hostile, the human ego scrambles to find a domain that it can completely govern. For Gen Z, that domain became their digital identity and their internal emotional state. When you can't afford a house, when politics look like a reality TV circus, and when the economy tells you that your degree is probably going to be replaced by an API next month, you stop investing in the future. Instead, you invest hyper intensively in the micro narrative of your own feelings. You don't build a life, you curate an aesthetic. You don't solve problems, you post about them. It's a brilliant defense mechanism, but it's a catastrophic way to live. I mean, think about the sheer volume of information that this generation processes. The human brain was never evolved to absorb the collective trauma, vanity, and opinions of 8 billion people simultaneously before breakfast. From a cognitive perspective, this leads to systematic catastrophizing. When your worldview is fed to you by an algorithm optimized for outrage and despair, your nervous system remains in a chronic state of low-grade fight or flight. As a recovered alcoholic, this looks incredibly familiar to me. What do we do in active addiction? We look at a reality that we can't handle, and then we find a substance or a behavior to numb our awareness of it. Gen Z isn't necessarily turning to alcohol at the same rates as previous generations. The data actually shows that they're drinking significantly less, probably because they can't afford it. But do not mistake that for sobriety. They're hyper-medicated on digital displacement. The screen is the new glass of whiskey. It numbs the existential dread just as effectively, and it fits right in the palm of your hand. Now, let's get into the clinical critique. And as a psychology student, this part drives me absolutely insane. Gen Z is undoubtedly the most psychologically literate generation to ever walk the earth. They know the diagnostic criteria for everything. They can identify a cognitive distortion from a mile away. But there's a massive difference between psychological literacy and emotional maturity. What we have witnessed over the last few years is the weaponization of clinical terminology to justify basic human selfishness and emotional avoidance, as we discussed with the millennials. So to give a better understanding, we're going to break down the translation matrix of modern pop psychology versus actual clinical reality. A pop psychology term is setting a boundary. How Gen Z will use this is cutting off anyone who minorly inconveniences or disagrees with them. The actual clinical reality of this phrase is a rule for your own behavior to keep you safe, not a mandate to control other people. Another pop psychology term is gaslighting. Gen Z is going to use this when someone remembers an argument differently or challenges their own view. The actual clinical reality of this phrase is a systematic, malicious, psychological abuse tactic designed to erase reality. Pop psychology consistently uses the term trauma. Gen Z is going to use this to represent any uncomfortable, embarrassing, or stressful life event. But the actual clinical definition of trauma is a profound psychological rupture that overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to cope. And one of the most overused terms in pop psychology is narcissist. Gen Z is going to use this term to describe an ex-partner who was self-centered or someone who broke up with them in a bad way. The actual clinical way to describe this term is a pervasive, severe personality disorder characterized by a total lack of empathy. We've taught an entire generation to mistake discomfort for danger. If an interaction requires emotional labor, it's labeled as toxic. If a friend calls out your bad behavior, they're violating your peace. If a job asks you to perform under pressure, it's an unsafe environment. By pathologizing the normal gritty function of human relationships, Gen Z is accidentally building their own solitary confinement. You can't build resilience in a room where the walls are padded and everyone else is banned. Consider the concept of concept creep, which is a psychological phenomenon which was documented by researcher Nick Haslam. It describes how the definitions of harm-related concepts begin to expand over time to encompass less severe phenomena. For instance, when everything is trauma, then nothing is trauma. When every bad day is a depressive episode, we diminish the agony of the clinical depressive who literally cannot pick their head up off the pillow. This hyper-focus on fragility creates an identity which is built around diagnoses. In the DSM-5, a diagnosis is a tool that's used to map a path toward healing and functional recovery. For Gen Z, a diagnosis has frequently become a badge of honor, a permanent identity marker, and a shield against accountability. I can't show up for you because my anxiety is flaring up. I can't finish this project because of my executive dysfunction. Let's apply some brutal honesty here. Your diagnosis may be an explanation for your behavior, but it is never an excuse for your lack of character. In recovery, we have a saying, it's not your fault that you're an addict, but it is your responsibility to get sober. Gen Z has mastered the art of assigning fault, but they're terrified of accepting the responsibility. Let's pivot to the spiritual and biblical dimensions of this crisis, because you can't fully diagnose Gen Z without realizing that they're suffering from an acute spiritual famine. They are the most secularized generation in modern history. They've watched traditional religious institutions stumble, compromise, and fail, and in response, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. But human beings are inherently religious creatures. If you don't worship the Creator, you'll find a creature or a concept to put on that altar. Gen Z pulled down the traditional altars and erected an altar to the self. The prevailing dogma of our culture is the phrase, live your truth. It sounds incredibly empowering on TikTok audio. It sounds deeply compassionate. But from both a psychological framework and a biblical framework, it's an absolute death sentence. The absolute worst advice that you can give a struggling human being is to tell them to follow their own heart. The heart is deceitful above all things. If I had followed my truth 10 years ago, I'd be dead in a ditch with a bottle in my hand or a needle in my arm. In recovery, my truth was a lie that was actively trying to kill me. What Gen Z doesn't realize is that when you become your own God, you also have to become your own savior. And when your world starts falling apart, you quickly realize you lack the power to save anything. Let's look at the book of Judges. There's a repeating line throughout that text that perfectly describes our current cultural landscape. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right by his own eyes. And what followed that era? Chaos, fragmentation, betrayal, a systemic breakdown. That's the exact psychological state of hyper-individualism. When everyone is living their own truth, there's no shared reality. There's no baseline anchor. And look at the crushing psychological weight that places on a young person. If there's no objective moral framework, if there's no divine design, then you have to invent your own purpose. You have to manufacture your own identity out of thin air. You have to decide what your gender is, what your values are, what your career is, and what your cosmic significance is, all while trying to pass your midterms and figure out how to pay rent. It's an exhausting, soul-crushing burden that no 20-year-old was ever designed to carry. Furthermore, look at how the internet has replaced the structures of religion without any redemption. The internet has a very clear code of righteousness. It has an unyielding law. And if you violate that law, if you say the wrong thing, or you post the wrong thing, or you hold an unapproved opinion, you're cast out, you're canceled. But notice what the digital world lacks. It has no mechanism for forgiveness. It has an endless day of atonement, but no sacrifice that's ever sufficient. It has an insatiable internet purity culture, but no grace. Christ offers the exact opposite paradigm. In John 14:6, he doesn't say, go out and discover your truth. He says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Objective truth exists outside of your fluctuating emotional states. That sounds restrictive to the modern mind, but psychologically, it's the ultimate relief. It means the universe doesn't rest on your shoulders. It means that your identity isn't anchored in how well you perform on screen or how perfectly you articulate your feelings. It's anchored in the finished work of a sovereign God who loved you enough to die for you while you were still an absolute mess. Whew, all right. We're bringing this to a close. So let's bring it back to the core of what we do here. We look at the reality. We speak the hard truth, but we always leave room for grace. To any Gen Z listeners who made it this far without rage quitting, I want you to hear me clearly. The older generations, the boomers who institutionalized greed, the Gen Xers who checked out into cynicism, the millennials who traded their souls for superficial validation, we built the fragmented, hyper-digitalized, economically volatile world that you're currently trying to survive in. We handed you an environment of extreme instability, and then we mocked you for feeling unstable. That's our failure, not yours. But the victimization has to stop. You can't change the environment that you inherited, but you can choose how you respond to it. If you want to rebel against the reality that you've been handed, stop trying to be unique on the internet. You want to be a real radical in 2026? Delete the apps that make you hate your life. Look people in the eye when they talk to you. Show up for a job early and work with absolute excellence, even when no one is watching and even when that job is miserable. Put down your therapeutic shield. Look at your own flaws and ask God for the strength to change. True strength isn't found in asserting your truth. It's found in submitting to the truth. To the parents, to the leaders, to the managers listening to this, stop coddling the fragility, but don't abandon the relationship. Gen Z is desperately searching for authenticity because they've been fed a diet of plastic, algorithmic simulation since infancy. They can spot a fake from a mile away. If you approach them with self-righteous judgment, they'll tune you out instantly. But if you approach them with the uncompromising truth wrapped in radical grace, the same grace that pulls an addict out of the gutter, you'll see them respond. Thank you all for tuning in to another Sober Psychology episode on the generations. If this episode challenged you, if it made you uncomfortable, or if it gave you a framework to understand the young people in your life, do me a favor. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, drop a review, hit the subscribe button, and then remember, sobriety isn't just about putting down the bottle. It's about waking up to reality. Stay grounded, stay real, keep your head up, keep your heart open, and go help somebody. Love you guys.